I'm so glad to meet you, Jake. Thank you for coming on to the podcast. You're in Toronto, Canada.
I am. Hello,
I
hi.
I don't think I've ever had anybody on the podcast from Canada. So, hello, my first Canadian podcast guest.
I love that. I guess I'll just have to use my Canadian accent with. I'll
Eh?
make sure I use a exactly.
So, I've never been to Canada. What is the impression of Americans, or maybe specifically Californians in Canada? What's the general consensus about who we are?
You know what? I get this question a lot, and people are always so curious onto like what we think. It's just so
Yeah.
funny to me because culturally we're so similar.
Uh-huh.
And I think probably where the differences show up are in our demeanor. Often when I'm working with people based in the US, people often say, like, you have a very like calm, cool,
Mm,
collected kind of vibe. And so, I mean, I've noticed in working with a lot of Americans, I think that's one of the big differences that I noticed that right in Canada, like the urgency like isn't so heightened and isn't as
mm,
big.
mm.
Um, but that could just be me also. I
No,
don't
you
know.
seem calm, and I think that like a major difference I noticed is especially being Southern Californian. It sounds like everything we're saying is a question at the end, and we're like our phrases go higher instead of like tapering off. And so by comparison, of course you sound calmer. Everything doesn't sound like it's a question or it's so pressing, right?
That's so funny. I really relate to that, but I even relate to it even just from my own experience. And I feel like as Canadians, we tend to also have our own little quirks and stuff too. So I get it.
Well, welcome my first Canadian guest on the podcast. I'm so excited. So, I follow you on Instagram and I love, 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 love the things that you write. And I've recently been listening to your podcast. So, I had to have you on so that we can talk about some of the things that I've been spying on and eavesdropping on. So, I'm so excited for it. So, one of the things that you recently said that I love, but I want to like dig in a bit more with you is you said, ignore your thoughts. Right? Here's a quote that you said. When we attach to our thoughts, we teach them the speed at which they arise, and the content contained within them matters enough to divert our full attention. Preach, Brother Jake. Tell me more about this because it sounds so easy when we therapists say, just ignore those thoughts. They're irritating, they're not helpful. How do we do that? Help us.
Yeah. Wow. I have recently started to make a differentiation between thoughts and thinking.
Mm,
And the way that I describe thoughts or define thoughts are specifically in their automatic and for their automaticity.
hmm
So thoughts are things that we cannot control. For example, when I say to you, do not think of a pink elephant, you have the automatic thought of a pink elephant, right? That's a thought that just pops up
Yes.
because of a situational cue or something in your environment that causes you to remember something, remind you of something, or even just out of the blue call something up. And
hmm
so those are our automatic thoughts, as we know. We can also introduce other thoughts into that mix. When we
Mm,
introduce other thoughts into that mix, that's thinking, right? We are actively thinking consciously by introducing new thoughts. When we have automatic thoughts that are skewing negative, those are the ones that I think are helpful to acknowledge, to just be aware of,
yeah.
to be able to kind of shoo away if it's not helping us. And then specifically the ones we want to try to ignore or avoid are stacking on layers of thinking that are unhelpful or harsh. And so when I sort of think about when I'm thinking about different ways of thinking and different automatic thoughts that kind of just come across our desk, I kind of imagine myself as like the CEO of my own business and my own body. I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, which ones am I going to focus on and which ones are actually not relevant to the business? Which ones are not actually helpful for the functioning and for the health and well-being of this thriving person? And so I I swipe by 80%, probably roughly 80% of thoughts because it's just data, it's just information that I'm having to sort of swipe through. And so that's what I mean by when I say when we're looking at the pace at which those thoughts come, sometimes we take the intensity of them and think that it means that they matter more. We think that it means that we have to focus on them more and more, but that's not actually true.
I love this idea that most of us think we have to do something about our thoughts. Like the very fact that they're there, it's a requirement for some reason that we attend to them. right? It's like, I had this negative thought. I don't like the way I look in this shirt in the mirror, right? And so our brain says, well, you better do something about it. You better like go on a diet. You better like shame yourself. You better stop wearing that shirt, right? Instead of like, is that helpful? I don't have time to change my shirt. I like this shirt, right? You're also like sort of this idea of, do I give it this attention? I get to choose if it's a negative or positive attention. I get to pay attention to the fact that I'm having the thought and that I don't have to do something about it.
Absolutely. When I look at some of the research, I remember the research of Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, and she looked at the lifespan of an emotion, and she found through her work that emotions only last about 90 seconds. A minute and 30 seconds is the lifespan of an emotion. And the thing that makes those emotions get more amplified, become more intense, or stay with us, or maybe have a sticky quality to them, is our thoughts and the way that we think about what's going on. And so I kind of picture, pouring gasoline onto an emotion with our thoughts. And that can just turn, a candlestick into a bonfire, into a forest fire, into a really large fire if we continue just to add all this fuel.
Oh, I love that. That I'm fueling my own thoughts. I'm fueling my own emotions, which means I also have the ability to pour water on them, put a blanket off them, smolder it, or just like walk away. Somebody needs to call the fire department because that's too big for me.
That's right. And to use kind of that fire analogy, sometimes we take these really big thoughts, these big dark thoughts, or we take these big heavy emotions and we pull the fire alarm when really it's just the smoke detector going off because we burnt something small. And I think that when we're calling the fire department every single time because we've burnt some muffins, that turns everything into urgent and intense and catastrophic and disastrous.
Why do you think we give so much attention to the negative thoughts? Because arguably we have just as many positive thoughts, but we don't really give them the street cred or the space in our bandwidth that we do our negative thoughts.
My background is in neuroscience, and I really enjoyed sort of learning from an evolutionary perspective to really just describe like how did we get here? Like what advantage did this actually offer us? And so when we look at that research, we sort of see that from an evolutionary perspective, it allows us to predict negative scenarios and allows us to also anticipate future dangerous or threats that are coming our way. So we've evolved to actually predict the worst case scenario. We've evolved to actually have to try to find safety in a potentially unsafe situation. And so what I like to sort of think about in terms of that is that unfortunately humans are just really bad guessers. We are prediction machines, but we're just really bad at guessing. And that's what I like to say to my clients who are teenagers. I like to say, so it sounds like you're guessing. You're trying to get ahead of it before it has happened. And so when we're overthinking, we kind of have that really active mind. Often it's really helpful just to call it what it is, which is that you're guessing. You're just trying to predict the future when you can't actually do that.
We're looking for patterns too, right? So that we can avoid some perceived potential future pain, which increases our anxiety, but it makes sense from a biological perspective because back when we used to participate in a tribe, we needed to make sure that the tribe didn't like send us out on a desert island or send us out on a boat somewhere. And the way that I could do that is I could participate, make sure they were happy with me, make sure I was well received, that I was a popular member of the tribe. And so we kind of still seems like carry that biological function into something that doesn't make sense anymore. Nobody's going to kick us out of the tribe. There's no place to go. You're stuck with me. Right. But yet
That's
we
right.
still try to figure out what are the things that are going to get us ostracized from the crowd.
Absolutely. And I would say that really at the root of all of that is that shame piece, right? That sense of like, I'm going to be kicked out. And I've often heard shame as being referred to as the poison fruit emotion, like one taste of it. And you're like, I never want to feel that again because it was so awful. But here's the thing about things like shame, anxiety, anger, anything really that produces any bodily discomfort through that emotional sense is that it's actually supposed to be uncomfortable. That's the whole reason why that mechanism works. It's meant to be uncomfortable so that we avoid it. And so any situation that triggers our shame, any situation that triggers our anxiety, we learn to avoid it because of the discomfort that it produces. And so it creates a sort of like sense of, I have to get away from that. Oh my gosh, I never want to feel that ever again. And then it sends us down that thinking rabbit hole, right? As an attempt to avoid that for the future.
And I think that that plays very nicely into that thought that you had on your your Instagram about ignoring your thoughts, because then you're learning how to tolerate something distressful by choosing another opportunity to do something different. And by continuing to do different things, you'll build up your tolerance to the stress of that shame.
Totally.
Great. Preach, brother. Okay. So you are like the guru of young people, in my opinion, as somebody who's not a young person. And I read a couple of things that you said, and I'm like, okay, I'm not super hip and cool like you are. So I have to go all the way to Canada to get cool. So a couple of things that you mentioned, I want to talk about what they are, and then you educate the older people like me, because I'm sure all the hipsters like you get all this. But so I read something that you had on your website about us coming out of cuffing season. And I read from you that, here, let me make sure I got this clear, that we snuggle in and get into relationships in the fall and winter because that's a good time to do such a thing. And so now we're coming out of this season of cuffing. Help me understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was actually approached by a reporter who wanted to talk about sort of this pattern that she was observing, and I had sort of pointed her in the direction of like, well, oh, this is cupping. This is a common phenomenon that happens here. Basically, she was interested in looking at why do we tend to sort of shack up, or why do we feel that relational pull towards the winter months or towards the seasons that feel, stereotypically a little bit more lonely. And so we tend to shack up with people, or we want to actually like try to engage in relationship. So we may actually be more like present on dating apps. We may actually put ourselves out there more. And that can follow a seasonal curve for many people. And so cuffing season is sort of a little nod to that sort of notion of we want to kind of handcuff ourselves to somebody else for protection, for warmth, for safety, when historically there is more loneliness kind of on in the future. And so we see that happening a lot with millennials is specifically what we were talking about, because I think they show up a ton on dating apps. But millennials in the winter months, especially here in Canada where it gets cold and people want to be close, they want to snuggle up, all that good stuff. So that's cuffing season.
So we hibernate more in the winter time,
That's
and
right.
so we want somebody to be in the cave with us.
That's
So
it.
we were doing that throughout the pandemic then. I mean, we really were like finding our person real quick and cuffing up with each other.
That's exactly right. And I love that you mentioned that, because it really sort of speaks to that evolutionary drive to survive. And because we are a social species, we need each other. I would actually argue that we're an ultra social species. We don't just need each other to be well, we actually need each other in order to live and survive. And so I think that is much more of a biological drive and an ultra social need than just, the social need to like have friends and to be connected. Like we actually need each other to survive.
Yeah. Which leads into something I heard I listened to a few of your podcasts. Again, that very calm voice on your podcast. And you and your co-host were talking about loneliness and the biological functioning and the neurological impact that it has when we are lonely. And I think that this cuffing idea speaks to a behavior that we do that is driven by a need to not feel so alone, right? And it's a behavior that we've done to try to adapt to it so we can avoid feeling lonely. Because you talked quite a bit in the podcast about how loneliness affects our brain. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there was a study that my co-host Simon and I were talking about, which found that they send researchers away into the Antarctic. There are 11 people that they sent out to live up there for their job, and they studied their brains and looked at the impact of social isolation on brain development. And they found actually that social isolation, similar to that experienced by people who are experiencing loneliness, affects negatively the prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking and planning part of our brain, and is also responsible for our social functioning and our ability to socially engage with other people. And so they actually notice that it starts to deteriorate when people are socially isolated. The prefrontal cortex starts to minimize and to shrink in its capacity and its ability to actually access those executive functions to connect.
And our prefrontal cortex is also our administrative assistant that says, don't say that. That's not a good idea. That's not going to serve you well. Don't do that behavior. And so if we don't have anybody to check us, And we're not running past these thoughts and we're not ignoring these thoughts. We perseverate on those thoughts and we continue to stay in this big loop, which continues to make us believe that we won't be well served by coming out of our cave and cuffing with people. And then we just have what? A hot mess that we need to go visit you? Like how do we break this cycle?
I love this question because what I would have thought prior to reading this study was that the goal to help lonely people not be lonely is to get them social connection and to get them more friends. And this same study also found that that wasn't enough. So using an exposure-based treatment approach to help people, reduce their sense of loneliness or even repair the executive functioning parts that are lost to loneliness, it actually requires therapy. It requires a therapeutic level of connection, not just, a social connection.
So this is something that I worry about for my millennial clients is there seems to be so much self-induced isolation because there's a lot of screens, right? I'm happy to say I grew up in high school when there wasn't a lot of screens. I am so dating myself right now, but I had to have conversations. I had to not send you a text that I didn't misunderstand. How is all of this impacting this concept of loneliness? Because you talked about in your podcast, which I'm also aware of, both the UK and now the United States have kind of said we're in our own epidemic of suffering and crisis because we are so lonely. How do I help my clients that are millennials, since this is your jam and your category? What do I say to them? How do I give them support?
Yeah, it is my jam. It's my category. I like to sort of describe my work as living at the intersection between technology and well-being. That is something that I am both equally passionate about. And I think that in today's modern context, that's not something that we can ignore. And the modern stressors, specifically, with millennials and Generation Z, or Gen Z, we look at the impact of the internet and technology and specifically social media as ways that it is repatterning our ways of connecting. And one of the ways I think it does that is by retraining our like a narcissistic level of self-focused, a level of self-focus that is so inward and so, let's say, socially rogue that does not help us really wire that part of our brain that needs to be with other people. And so to your point, yeah, I'm also seeing that as well, that we are hardwired for connection. However, when we're not using that hardwiring, then it starts to go away, right? It's that sort of use it or lose it sort of thing. And I'm noticing it just really increasing competition, really increasing comparison, astronomical levels of loneliness, declining friendships, declining in job seeking, all these really big impacts, right? That I, as a therapist, of course, am hyper attuned to. And so I think here's another thing that I often think about, which is that knowing is not enough. Just knowing these stats is not enough to help us.
Yeah.
And that comes from some of the research from Yale around the G.I. Joe fallacy. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. G.I. Joe, of course, is the cartoon from the 80s that sort of surfaced this sort of point, which is that once you know better, then you can do better. So it's a sort of like, now you know,
Right.
and go off and take all this knowledge
Maya
and go.
Angelou, when you know better, you'll do better. Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so G.I. Joe sort of said knowing is half the battle. And what we know through research is that it's actually not true. It's about a quarter of the battle.
It just
Uh,
normalizes the battle, but it doesn't give you tools for the battle.
That's it. It's probably the first step, right? The first step is just being aware, building some insight into, oh, I should probably focus on that, or oh, that's interesting that that's a problem. And so, yeah, this is the big thing that's coming up in my therapy rooms, which is that thinking isn't doing. Thinking about our problems isn't the same as solving them. Learning about this information isn't the same as applying them. Not to call people out who are, of course, listening to this, but listening to a podcast about this stuff isn't the same as learning how to apply it. Buying self-help isn't the same as actually putting it into action. So, we're in a big thinking culture right now, just so much thinking and so much knowledge consumption. We're just swimming in all this information. And I really see us struggling to apply it.
I feel like that's what we're uncuffing from the pandemic is I just remember so many days of just like being in my own head. Nobody challenging me, even if you have a partner, they're off doing their thing. And so we're just thinking our thoughts, thinking our thoughts, thinking our thoughts, and obsessing and becoming sort of like narcissists not because we are self-absorbed, but because we're self-full, right? We're full of our own thoughts, and there was no way to challenge them or have human interactions. And so now, yes, we're normalizing that we need to do something different. What is a call to action then? So if we're having people who are listening to this podcast and they're just like normalizing, like, yeah, they diagnosed me. That's what I got. That's me. What's a baby step that we can encourage our listeners to do that will help them step out of this?
One of my favorite strategies is just to use this very simple script. And it goes like this. I'm feeling blank, which means I need blank. And so I will blank. Using the entry point of our needs to connect our feelings into actions is really the work here. Identifying what we're feeling, translating that into a need. Our needs really are just information. And our feelings are sort of there to get our attention, to cue us into what we need. And so I'm feeling blank, which means I need blank. And so I will blank. That's the hardest part, is that last part. And I find that right now we're even struggling to even identify our needs.
100%.
Our feeling.
Yes,
and our
that is
feelings.
like, as a couples therapist, that is like all day long, every day. I'm like, okay, so turn to your partner and ask for your need. What? Right? And I think that double down on that is there's a fear that my partner won't meet my needs, so therefore I don't ask for it. And as I say to my clients, it's not about whether or not your partner is going to do it. You need to get clear on what your needs are and offer them out loud so that you can normalize for yourself and acknowledge for yourself you have them. It's not about whether or not other people do it. It's whether or not you are aware that you, number one, deserve it, that you want it, and what are you going to do about it if the other person can't validate you or do it for you, because that's not what this is about.
Ooh, that's so good. So to bring it back to that script, it's, I'm feeling scared, which means I need connection. And so I will ask for a hug.
And even if the person's like, I'm not giving you a hug right now, I'm mad at you. Okay, I need a hug. Let me give myself a hug. Let me go ask a friend for a hug. Let me go hug the dog. I need some way to feel close and connected. And I'm not going to ignore this, because when I ignored it, then I just push my needs aside, and that's not a healthy place for me to be.
Absolutely. I would say this script is great for boundary setting. It's great for emotional discernment. It's great for translating thoughts into actions. It's great for finding motivation. Like I find that this script, especially like for my teenage clients, it's just so simple. It's so actionable. And it's a really easy way to do that translation work that I think we get so lost in the shuffle of doing it when we're just stuck in overthinking.
Yeah, great. I love that. Very easy to follow. Okay, let me go back to something else that you taught me. You taught me another concept called trauma fishing. And I would love for you to describe what that is, because I'm like, yes, oh my God, that like happens all the time to my clients. Go.
Wow. Yeah, it's something that I've been trying to find language for about 3 years now. I think in the pandemic, as I was talking about, we kind of became really self-focused. And as you identified, it really like took us away from each other and away from our connections. What I started to notice were patterns, specifically on social media, of people, number one, oversharing about really big and hard things, something that from my perspective doesn't probably belong on the internet and for it to live there forever.
And it's always vague. Like, it's vague enough that you have to get a response, because it's like, oh my God, today was so rough. I'm not sure I'm going to make it through. Oh my God, Jake, what is going on with you? Are you okay? And then you're like bombarded with care and concern.
Absolutely. And so I've noticed specifically, I think it happens with many different ages, but because I work with young people, this is where I see it show up is, so I post the thing and then I get all this love and attention back to me. And then I kind of get validation for actually sharing in the hard things. And I think that is the work of becoming healed, becoming more self-developed. And I think that I'm doing the work. In fact, it leads us into this like pattern of asking for that in other people. In our new relationships, then we require or we request, like, tell me about all the traumas you've been through. Tell me about all the really hard things that you've sat through. The amount of clients that I've talked to who have been on first dates and they feel like they have to barf out all this information about themselves, or someone is asking them to go really deep and dark on the very first date. And so
Which is
I
inappropriate because
inappropriate.
we shouldn't be sharing that level of openness with someone we haven't vetted.
Exactly.
Because we
And so
don't
I
know how they can handle it. We don't know if they have the skills or it's going to trigger them or what they're emotionally capable of. And God forbid they just minimize what you said and then you leave like this big open wound. I mean, let's just set aside that whole thing. But yes, there's this encouragement to like just open it all up and like splay it out for someone who's a complete stranger.
Yeah, and I've even noticed it in first sessions that I've seen with my clients that some of my younger clients will come to session and they'll just dump everything. And instead of doing that, I like to sort of set up the space ahead of time and just sort of say, there may be some things that are on your mind. There may be some things that you've experienced in your life. We may not get to it all today. We're just going to put some of it out on the table today. And then what we're going to do before you leave is put it back into a jar. You're
Yeah.
going to carry that jar with you and you are going to open that jar when you feel safe and ready to do so. But we're not going to just dump the jar all over the table because that will just make a big mess for us to clean up. And so we want to practice some boundary setting, practice some discernment, practice some sense of like, I have my own emotions and my own privacy that doesn't concern everybody else. And so anyway, I'm seeing this sort of pattern, which I've termed trauma fishing, where people are looking for that in other people and they're trauma dumping on others to sort of engage in this like back and forth version of what they're calling connection, but it's not real deep connection or vulnerability.
And what I learned from you then, I of course went a deep dive and I was like reading everything, Googling. And what I saw, which was made sense but was traumatizing, is that there were some, not to be stereotypical, but some dudes were bragging about how they trauma fished someone. And then because they were vulnerable, they got to sleep with them that night. And so it was like this whole like dating technique tip thing. And I was like, oh my God, this is very upsetting. So I might encourage you if we're on a date to tell me all about your traumas. Then when you're vulnerable, I don't share the same level of trauma. It creates this awkwardness where I want to like validate that I should have been trauma with you. So then I have sex with you so that I feel we're closer and more connected. So it validates that I shared this inappropriate thing. It sounds like problematic. It's just a lot. Is this what's happening?
Well, I mean, I just want to take a moment to just say that like this is really new stuff, right? This isn't stuff that in the past 5 years, even as a therapy community, we've really sort of sat with the nuance of. And so I think that number one, yes, that is what I'm seeing as well. And number two, I really don't know how equipped we are to sort through the layers of supporting someone through the really nuanced experience that I think that people are going through. And so I'm seeing a lot of therapists come feeling really unequipped to have these conversations because they don't really know, the reference points or the context for what's being talked about. And a ton of people coming to therapy being like, I don't even know, I don't have language to even describe what's happening here. So I feel so like left out, right? Just without support. And so many layers, but I think a lot of it comes back to that technology cross with well-being that I think we're really going to be tasked with as a therapy community.
So how do we guide our clients to think before you share? And how do they vet whether or not it's an appropriate time to share? Because I think that that's probably something that we can help with.
I think so too. And for me, it really does come back to relationships and comes back to emotions and comes back to needs and therefore comes back to that sense of boundary setting and just like knowing ourselves so that we can know each other really well. And I think that that is one of the tasks that I find so difficult is how can I participate and show up as a person, an individual, so that I can show up in my relationships. And I really kind of sort through a lot of the language, the technology layers of the complex kind of workings of all these layers that it really, for me, it comes back to relationships. It comes back to how do I show up in this relationship? And I think that's really the skills that we're helping people work on.
And it sounds like from what we're saying that are we too focused on external validation? right? Because if I'm trying to get you to acknowledge that I've done my work so that I give you the impression or manage you into thinking, well, I'm deep, let me show you all the work that I've done. That's not the goal. The goal is not to impress somebody with how much therapy that you've had or how deep you can go or like all the layers that you've gone through. What is that need and that drive that on a first date that somebody thinks that you've done so much with your life? Like, where is this drive for external validation? And does that loop back to the fact that I'm in constant comparison and contrast with everyone on social media, and then that just fuels that need for external validation?
Absolutely. I think that one of the other really big impacts of social media and the internet is that it almost, I don't quite have language to describe it quite yet, but the language I do have is that I think it's really mixing with our reality and being able to discern like what is real and what is actually playing out. And I think that's no shock that the term gaslighting was such a popular term in the past few years, because I really do think that it speaks to that notion of like, well, I have my reality, you have your reality. What happens when our realities don't match? And what happens when my reality, when I look on my phone and on the internet, is very different than what I experience in real life? I am sorting through a lot of kid feelings at the moment with this very topic. An example of this is people on TikTok seeing families engage on YouTube and TikTok and social media, and then kids looking to their own families and being like, that's not my parents. That's not how my parents speak to me. I see it on TikTok where this family, like they all love each other. They all go on these great vacations and they all like have such a good time. And then kids go, that's not me. That's not my experience. And that makes for a reality, right? That just is really hard for kids to sort through.
And because when we're younger, we don't have perspective. We don't have
Right.
the ability to be like, that is like 5 minutes out of them family, and you should see the trip they got to get to the campsite.
That's
You should
it.
everyone was checked out, everyone's looking at their screens, mom and dad were yelling at each other, and we like managed to get it together for 5 minutes and like make a happy video because we got it, we're some sort of influencer and we're getting paid. Like, but there isn't that perspective yet of understanding that, are you questioning, and comparison is the thief of joy. So you've basically taken away everything that's positive in your relationship with your parents. And because it didn't match up to 5 minutes of, orchestrated life, now you think that you don't have what you need.
It's fascinating, right? And I sort of look at social media as operating as this hyper reality. It keeps us really focused on a version of reality that is not attainable, not real, and is hyper real, for that exact reason that you mentioned, which is that it's all fabricated. It's none of it is actually real.
I love this. I could talk to you all day long, and I know that you have stuff to do, but I definitely wanted to introduce you to my audience. I love your little tagline that it's a fun, flirty conversation about mental health. And I love having fun, flirty conversations about mental health. And you are just as delightful as I thought you would be. I would love to have you on again at some point when I learn some new phrases from you that I need to totally understand better. I will continue scouring your Instagram and have you back on if you would be willing to.
I would love that. That would be so special and so amazing. I'd love
So
that.
let everybody know where they can find you. I'm going to put it in the show notes, but where else should they seek out your wisdom?
Listen, if you like what you heard, or if you want to get in touch with me, you can follow me at MSW Jake. You can also search me up on the internet. That's where I like to hang out, and talk some shit about being on the internet as well.
And don't forget your podcast. Your podcast
Oh,
is called what?
this isn't therapy. It's a little bit of a play on the fact that we are not doing therapy. We like to just have some fun, not make fun. We like to show up, pull some themes from the therapy room, and we talk about it on each episode. So it's a good time. It's very fun.
So great to meet you in real life, Jake. This has been delightful. And again, my first Canadian guest. So you will always have a place in my heart.
The pleasure has been mine. Congratulations on all your success. It's great to meet you.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning into the D Spot. Find me, Dr. Dana McNeil, and my guests on social media using the links down below. Subscribe for new episodes weekly and leave a comment letting us know how and if you can relate or what topics you'd like us to cover next. See you next time, and don't forget, going to therapy is cool.